How's it guys? Welcome back. Sorry I missed yesterday. I had a track meet. But here we go. We are up to chapter 5, is it? Chapter 5, the testimony. A truly great person is the one who gives you a chance. Paul Duffy. Dad had an unexplainable affection for deaf people. He could pick them out in a huge crowd as they have an unmistakable noise that sounds like mo mo. As a result, he would call them mobo. He would smile and go up to them, shake their hand, ask how many wives the man had, and go through all the usual greetings, using hand signs all the time. Dad liked to hire these men as he found that due to the fact that they could not explain things properly, they never stole anything. So all the laundry was done by bobos, and the chap that cut all the lawns was also a bobo. Dad was their hero. He was the first person to have given them the opportunity of a job, and they knew that he got bobo jobs all over the country. The Indian store in Busheni hired one of Dad's bobos as their main man to load and unload the trucks. He was a strong man who could lift 2 bags weighing 200 pounds each, one in each hand. I was always interested in watching Dad communicate with them. My sister Patty had long hair, shown by running fingers from the top of her head to the shoulders, and firm pointy breasts, made by holding fists in the appropriate place with the thumbs pointing up. My mother was long hair, and fists with the thumbs pointing down, whereas my granny was long hair and hands held flat against the chest where the breasts ought to be. One day, one of the laundrymen came running to Dad and while making his boo boo noises, proceeded to tell Dad about his wife, who was trying to have a baby, but it was a breech delivery and the baby was stuck. This took about 5 seconds to relate, and Dad understood immediately. Took the Peugeot 404 station wagon. We all went to his home, picked up the wife, and brought her to the hospital, where she had a successful delivery. Afterwards, that boo-boo would come and hug Dad every time he walked by. From the hospital, there was a cement walkway that went by the laundry, all the way up the hill to the nurse's home. It was quite a steep hill, and after a long day of doing rounds and numerous operations, Dad would be tired. He would stop to rest and talk to his bobos who were doing the laundry. Halfway up the hill was a huge fig tree with a colony of black-crowned herons nesting in the upper branches. There were 52 nests, and I spent hours watching them, all the way from the egg-laying to the hatching about 25 days later. I was especially interested in the different animals the herons brought in to feed the young. I once saw a cane rat that must have weighed about 8 pounds. It was as big as a cat, and this was stuffed down the throat of a half-grown heron. Snakes, frogs, and other birds were all grist to the mill. Feeding was a full-time job, and then there were the predators. Eagles love to prey on the newly hatched herons. One day, my granddad came and sat with me and said, "I think we'll call that eagle Khrushchev, because he has told those herons that he will let them stay in their fig tree as long as they let him eat their babies." I wasn't much into politics, but whenever I repeated the eagle's name, people would ask why, and I would tell them what Granddad said. They always seemed to get a giggle out of that. From my vantage point, I could also see the whole of the cement walkway that led from the hospital, past the laundry, all the way to the nurse's home. Our home was just over the top of the hill behind the nurse's house. Imagine my surprise when I saw Dad talking to one of the boo-boos, and then he jumped onto his back, piggyback style, and the small man carried Dad up the hill. I didn't say anything, but the next day about sundown, I noticed the same boo-boo carrying Dad up the hill. That evening during dinner, I broached the subject. I noticed that you are having Boo Boo carry you up the hill these days, Dad. You! Dad shot at me. You've been spying on me. Then Dad went on to explain to me that when you do a good deed for someone with a primitive background, they have to do something for you. Otherwise a hatred develops between the two of you. By having him carry him up the hill at sundown, he was paying back a debt, and Boo Boo would never feel beholden to Dad. I knew that as I spent all my time out in the wilds, but it surprised me to the core that Dad had picked that up just working in the hospital every day. It was something very special he had done, and I was very proud of him. It wasn't long after that one of the Boo Boos told Dad of the Boo Boo at Bushenyi. Someone had made fun of him, and being unable to communicate, he had hit his tormentor and killed him with one smack. Dad immediately took time out of his busy schedule to drive over to Bushenyi and find out the details. There was a court case held in Mbarara, and Dad offered his testimony on behalf of the Boo Boo. Mbarara was about 40 miles from Ankoli Hospital, so it was a long round trip for one day. Dad stood in the courtroom and with his usual dignity explained what great people these deaf men were. He spoke of their handicap not being able to communicate with the hearing people, and how cruel many of them were to the deaf. He told of his experiences of working with these men through the years and how honorable they had been. He asked that the man be forgiven for his mistake, and that he personally, as the only doctor of that area, would be responsible for the man's behavior. Self-defense, 5 years suspended sentence, said the judge as he slammed down the gavel. Dad turned and smiled at Boo Boo. There was no explaining to do. The Boo Boo ran straight to Dad, bowed down, and held Dad's feet in his huge hands and let the tears run down. Somehow he knew that Dad's testimony had saved his life. It was my matric year at Helderberg in the Cape. I now knew the system. I knew how to bend the rules in my favor, and even when I got caught, I would offer to take cuts. But as I was so big, everyone knew that it wouldn't affect me in the least, so they usually let me off. Dad had insisted that I always be a gentleman, and this was paying off. Gussie had taught me how to handle my enemies with grace, and we were now friends. I even had 2 ladies that were not shy to say they were my friends. I had somehow, with a little manipulation and feigning ignorance, ended up in a typing class full of girls. I sat next to Yvonne Akers, a foxy chick who was going with a friend of mine. We had never really bonded until the day she threw a wad of paper into my typewriter well, while I was typing. I pulled out the paper I was typing and took the carbon paper, held her head firmly in a headlock, and proceeded to blacken her face with the carbon. Mrs. Webster, our teacher, just looked and laughed at the 2 of us. She even admitted that Yvonne deserved it. Somehow, that first incident bonded us for life, and we are still friends 40 years later. But there was still the odd incident that occurred due to my bad English or misunderstanding. Fridays were always special. Fridays were always special for me. Friday afternoon was always free for everyone. I made a lot of money selling peaches, honey, and other goods I had bought from the farm. Friday night was also special, as it was the only meal of the week that we got cake for pudding. My first year at Helderberg, the bigger boys used to take my cake and eat it. I learned that if I took grated brooklax and sprinkled it on top of the cake, the results were quite impressive. You could say they were explosive. After this happened, boys found that it wasn't worth stealing my cake. We also had bean soup every Friday night, which wasn't bad except for the effects that only started in earnest once we were in church for the Friday night meeting. Brothers were allowed to sit with their sisters on the girls' half of the auditorium, so Patty and I would sit together behind one Heather Thompson. She was a pretty lass with long blonde hair that hung way down her back. She used to smile at me in a coy fashion that would make my blood race. I looked for a way to show her how I felt about her. Then one Friday night, she wore this dress with a zip that went all the way from below the waist to her neck. The zip hadn't made it all the way and was peeking out between her long locks. My blazer pockets were always full of bits of hardware to keep me busy during the inevitable boring sermons. In no time, I had taken a paperclip, tied a string to it, slipped the paperclip into the eye of the zip, and attached the string to a thumbtack, which I pushed into the back of her chair. When we all stood up to sing a hymn, I had a chance to see the colour of Heather's tan, which quickly turned red. I also noticed that she didn't have on a slip, and discovered where the term brookie lace came from. She didn't give me coy looks after that, and all my efforts at romance had once again failed. Oh, I wonder why that didn't work, eh? Oh man, what an idiot. I love to sing songs of any kind, so singing hymns that Dad also sung was a pleasure. I would close my eyes, picture myself on a high mountain, tip my head back a bit, and make up for the quality of my singing with volume and enthusiasm. Then would come the 45-minute sermon. Patty would take my hand and turn the palm up, and slowly draw a circle in the palm of my hand. Within a minute I would be mesmerized, and she would keep me in this state until the end of the sermon. If she didn't, I would drive her crazy with all of my fidgeting. Now on this particular Friday night, it was raining and cold. I had been on another planet the whole sermon, when suddenly one of the students stood up and gave their testimony. It wasn't very long, perhaps a sentence or two. Wana fayaji. What are they doing? I whispered to Patty in Swahili. She explained what a testimony was, and how these people who stood up were giving their hearts to the Lord. I sat back and watched as almost everyone stood up and gave their testimony. It was apparent that Patty and I were going to be the only ones sitting, so Patty stood and said something. I sat there, looking all around at everyone standing. From the pulpit, the preacher kept saying, "There is still one soul who wants to give their testimony." I looked around, trying to see who that person could be, because all of them were standing at this point. It had been a long meeting, and I was starting to fidget again. Patty looked down, and in Swahili audibly said, "If you want to leave this hall tonight, I suggest you stand up and do like the rest." I was terrified, and what was I to say? I had heard about 300 students say the word consecrate, but didn't know what that meant. I knew about hospital terms like thrombocytopenia or scoline apnea, platelets, erythrocytes, because these were words Dad had taught me, but I had never been taught to give a testimony. On trembling legs I stood. The preacher beamed, nodding in my direction. In a faulty voice I managed to get out, I would like to constipate my life to the Lord." Consecrate, hissed Patty, but it was too late. Everyone was sniggering, whispering, and pointing at me. Both Patty and I were as red as could be. Somehow the spirit of the occasion had been spoiled, and it was all my fault. I suddenly needed to get out, and walked out early into the icy rain, which felt wonderful on my flushed face. Alright, there we go. That's it for tonight. I'll try and get another one in for tomorrow. I'll see you then. Good night. Cheers.